Hello, my name is George Paris. I'm a PhD chemist, and the title of today's presentation is How a Good Chemist Became a Bad Biologist, or a Weird Biologist. This was actually intended as an introduction to a series of videos I hope to make that go into some of the papers I've written. Everything that I'm going to talk about has been published in one form or another. You'll find my publications in Chem Abstracts, and you'll find them in PubMed. And some of the ones I'm going to talk about today are abstracted in those places. Some of them aren't. They were just published. I have a series of books published on Amazon.com. I think everything that I'm going to talk about, pretty much everything I've done relatively recently, is somehow or other captured on Amazon.com. Just look George E. Paris, P-A-R-R-I-S, up and Amazon.com, and you'll find these books, I hope, if they index them, if I haven't been canceled. In any event, give you an idea of what I'm talking about. This is one I've written and published. This is it's a paperback version on Amazon.com. Abiogenesis actually starts with the Big Bang and goes all the way through up to the point, the evolution of the universe, evolution of the solar system, evolution of the planet, up to the point where we create the molecules that were necessary for life. This would be amino acids and sugars and things like that. So this book attempts to address that issue. Following along, but this book actually covers about 5 different books I've covered, 5 different papers I've written, having to do with speciation, evolution, some other topics having to do with differentiation and development of organisms, things like that. The key book, the one I don't have because I gave it away, I've got another one ordered, but in any event, it is really the Evo Devo book, which really sort of started this whole process. And to explain to you how a good chemist got involved with all this biology and some other things, I need to go back a ways. Now, this is not really relevant to the series that I'm about to present. It's more of a matter of, most of it is more relevant to career development. If you are a young person going into science, going into chemistry, going into physics, you might want to think about how my career evolved. I'm almost 75 years old. I'm 74 and a half years old. And so I've seen a fair picture of what's going on. And I'm lucky that I'm very healthy and I still have a career. I'm still working out there, folks. You're not going to make me go away. Get used to it. In any event, let's go back. So this is George Paris's history. I apologize to those of you who are not interested in me, but it is interesting from a standpoint of the evolution of a career, evolution of a scientific area. I was born in 1947, and my father was a mechanic. He was a World War II veteran, and it's a long story, but he got interested in electroplating. He had a business he was trying to start which involved electroplating. And so we had electroplating stuff in the back room. We had an electroplating machine in our back room, plating nickel onto brass. He had a bunch of chemistry books around. And sometime in I guess it was early 60s, he brought home a series of books by Isaac Asimov, The World of Carbon, The World of Nitrogen, and I think they was like the elements or something like that. And I read those. He read those books. I read those books. They were interesting. And I got interested in chemistry. Isaac Asimov got me interested in chemistry. And when I got to high school, I started studying chemistry. I was always interested in science, but plants and animals and stuff. But I got interested in particularly chemistry. Made it to high school. Got interested. I had God bless you, Ms. Roebuck, wherever you are, a chemistry teacher. I guess I was a junior in high school, and did well, enjoyed it, thought that would be a good thing to do. And so I decided to make my career in chemistry. I was actually, I would say as early as the 8th grade, I was motivated to be a chemist. But by the time I graduated from high school, which was like 4 years later, I was like done. I ended up going to NC State University. I was raised just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and then a little town called Garner. And went to NC State. We were not people of means. This was the first year, 1965, that NC State was a college, as a university, as opposed to being a college. It was State College before that. And we had a big fight with UNC. UNC wanted to call us University of North Carolina at Raleigh or something like that. But anyway, we avoided that one. But so it was a relatively small, relatively backwater type of education. I recall going into my classes, especially my chemistry classes, and I met a gentleman by the name of G. Gilbert Long. He was a professor, and we had this after lunch recitation section. It was basically, you had your lecture. The lecture was like 200 people in a lecture room with some guy way down there. Dr. Wall, I recall, was one of those, trying to explain Bohr theory to us. And it was chaos. I had these big sections, had all these standardized tests we took. Anyway, to actually learn how to work the problems, we had these recitation periods. And Dr. Long was one of the people who drove that. And so it's like right after lunch, and like everybody in this class went to sleep, right? Except me. I was like, back there. Anyway, Long chewed the class out. I mean, he just ripped them a new one, right? And then at the end, he sort of, I don't know if he was like offering a peace branch or what, but he says, this was the spring of '66. This was the spring of my freshman year. And he said, well, I need some people to work in my lab this summer. If anybody's interested in working in a lab, come up and see me. So that was perfect for me. So I go up and introduce myself to Dr. Long and said, I'm George Paris, and I'd like to work in your lab. He said, fine, come by. All right. So it turned out I started working in the lab for Dr. Long in the summer. I was working full-time for him in the summertime, 40 hours a week. I also had some side jobs. I was working on a laundry, checking in and out clothes and stuff like that. But so I did that all summer, and then things went pretty well. He was working with antimony and arsenic. He was also hooked up with Dr. Doak and Dr. Friedman, who were doing mainly phosphorus chemistry. So Long's doing arsenic and antimony, and they're doing phosphorus, and Long was over in bismuth a little bit too. But I met a nice guy, a real nice guy. He was a grad student named Mike O'Brien. Don't know where Mike is. I'd love to be. I'd love to hear about how he went out. And there was another guy named Bobby Ray Zell from someplace. I don't know. He was in an organic group. Anyway, I got sort of integrated into this group. It was really, really nice of those guys. I got to go out to lunch with them, hang out, talk about lab, stuff like that. And learned a lot of technique, a lot of lab technique from them. And made compounds. We made things like trimethylstabine, trimethyl ammonium dibromide, tetramethyl stabonium bromide, triphenylmethyl stabonium tetrafluoroborate. I mean, cool stuff. So, doing this, a lot of Grignard reactions. So actually I worked for Long every summer, and then full-time. And then during the year I worked probably 6 or 7 hours a week. I earned enough money from that job to pay my way through college. I paid all my tuition and books and fees through that job, which was wonderful. Okay. And it was a great education. By the time I was a senior, we'd have new graduate students coming in, and I knew a lot more than they did about everything, really. And being a good student, had very high GPA in 3.6 something, whatever. I'm thinking like, I want to be in academia. You got to get a good education. You got to get a good PhD someplace. I've been thinking PhD since high school, since before high school. So anyway, which affected my social life, by the way. Not a whole different story, but so anyway, MIT is the place to go, right? Okay, you want to be well known. This, you know, the Boston area. This was the home of R.B. Woodward and D.J. Corey and all those other people who were people up there. So Ronald, but anyway, the I was in the organometallic area, and the editor of the organometallic journal was Seifert, Thietmar Seifert. And so I called up Thietmar Seifert, or somebody up there, and said, can I come up and interview, talk to you guys about going to MIT as a graduate student? And so in my senior year, well, it turns out, back up a little bit, in the summer before my senior year, Dr. Long took a long vacation. He liked to drive across the country with his family from place to place. So he was gone all summer. And he said, I want to set you over the project. He worked along gone. So basically, it turned out to be we'd made tribenzyl arsine oxide. He said, well, this will probably form complexes with all kinds of compounds. There's something published about that. Triphenyl phosphine oxide, for example. So he said, why don't you just see if you could make some, complexes of this compound. When I come back, we'll see what you got and whatnot. So I spent the whole summer taking tribenzyl arsine oxide and reacting it in, I think it was either acetonitrile or ethanol, with a whole series of metal salts, nitrates, chlorides, bromides, etc. And we made a bunch of these things. I did both first row transition elements and lanthanides. And so we had all these compounds. And I was analyzing them using EDTA titrations. So, the ones that were working, obviously I could prove that I had a right ratio of tribenzyl arsine oxide to metal halide or metal nitrate, whatever. So we had all these compounds, came back in the fall, Dr. Long said, hey, this is kind of cool. So we did conductance studies, we did magnetic studies, we did infrared studies during the fall, and we wrote two papers, actually ended up two papers. One was first row transition elements, one was that, and they got published in the Journal of Inorganic and Nuclear Chemistry. I was a senior in college. Dr. Long, being a really nice guy, said, hey, why don't you take this down to the ACS meeting in I guess it was in Florida, not Gainesville, but wherever it was. Maybe it was Gainesville, Florida State, wherever. So we went down there, and I gave the presentation. Great, exposure for a senior in college. And met a guy named Gene Ashby. Gene Ashby was a very handsome, outgoing, very cool guy. And he said, well, why don't you come down to Georgia Tech, work for me down at Georgia Tech. I'm thinking MIT, So after that was like January, I think, of 69, probably. So I still had my heart set on MIT, so I go to MIT. Or actually, I flew up to MIT. I must have got there up in late January or February. Several bad things happened on that trip. I flew up to Boston, and when we were coming into this airport, the airplane just did a nosedive into the airport, Logan Airport. My ears plugged up. I was in great pain, and I could barely hear. I hit the ground. When I'm on the ground, looking out the airplane window, and the wing of the airplane is just barely clearing the snowbanks. I'm in great pain. I can barely hear. Somehow I got off the airplane, made it through the airport. Didn't think about stopping to urinate in the airport, but I'm in the subway, and I noticed that there's a restroom here in the subway. I'm a southern boy, sorry. So I went into this restroom, and it was disgusting. It was like people stood inside the door and peed in the general direction of the toilet. That's sort of the way it was. That's why we don't have restrooms in subways, by the way. But, so I just sort of did the same. Got out, got back on the subway, and off to Cambridge, where it was. Found the right exit, got out, go up on the street, and just snow stacked on each side of the street, about 3 feet tall, 3 feet tall. Trudged through this stuff, got on the campus, found the building, go in to meet Cyphers. Go into this building. Didn't look like a chemistry laboratory, but it was a building. I think he was probably not in the mainstream of chemistry up there. Get to a secretary. So there's this outer sanctum. I go into the secretary, Dr. Cyphers' office. May I speak to Dr. Cyphers? This is George Paris. I'm here. I have an appointment. And she says something like, well, she was not a pleasant person. She was not a cheerful Southern lady. And so she basically let me in to see Dr. Cyphers. I'll come in and sit down. And I was with him probably 4 to 6 hours, something like that. And I don't remember one thing about chemistry that we talked about. The one thing I do remember he told me was that that MIT could not keep me out of the draft. Now, this was something I never thought about. This was Vietnam War time, 1969, Tet Offensive and all that stuff. But I never thought about being kept out of the draft. Okay. But apparently a lot of people must. I mean, that was like one of his big things. I'm like, what's that all about? I'm a pretty patriotic guy. So anyway, so I go in, and the labs in this building were no better than the labs in Old Withers Hall at NC State, 1930s type labs. It was nothing great about this lab. As a matter of fact, NC State had a nice NMR system. They had a 100 megahertz system with technicians that would run your samples for you and all that kind of stuff. I go into this, Cypher takes me into this room. He says, here's the NMR, and there's a sad-looking 60 megahertz instrument with pieces laying around, and it's dirty and dusty, and like, what's going on here? And then, by the way, we were there where there was a class change. We're standing out in the hall, and the class got out and ran. And it looked like a anti-war demonstration. All these guys with peace buttons and stuff, and long beards, and all that stuff out of there. So it was like, wow, that was not good. And by the way, I'm still can barely hear, and I'm in pain. So anyway, after this day, which didn't end too soon, actually, for my, I was happy to leave. I got back on that airplane, flew home, and I'm thinking, I am never going to MIT. This is chaos. The weather sucks. The facilities suck. Cypher's a nutcase. His secretary's a bitch, excuse me. But, so, it's like, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to go up there and put myself up there. Got back home, called up Gene Ashby down in Georgia Tech, said, at that point, I'd never been to Georgia Tech. I said, Dr. Ashby, can I come work for you? And he said, yeah, come on down. I said, I'll graduate in June. He said, as soon as you graduate, get on an airplane, come down here, see me, whatever. So I went down to Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was sort of a blend. Most of the labs were 1930s issue, like MIT and Withers Hall, but but they had a great glass shop. They had this guy named Don Lilly, who was an artist. He really was an artist in glass. Great glass shop. You've never seen anything like this. And then he also had a good NMR, 100 megahertz instrument with a technician, full-time guy from the Navy, forgot his name. And he had a very good group. The group that Gene Ashby had he followed through that work he was doing, I think would have been a Nobel Prize winning group, and it was certainly, I think, the strongest. He had a metal hydride group and an organic chemistry group, organic Grignard reagent, lithium reagent type group. The inorganic group was doing metal hydride chemistry, basically sort of supported by the Navy. These were rocket fuels, basically. And then you had this other group that was doing Grignard chemistry, Grignard and lithium and stuff like that. And they were doing mainly kinetic studies. A guy named Joe Lemley was doing kinetic studies. Anyway, I integrated in this immediately, and everything I touched turned to gold. It was like, They didn't have anybody who did NMR, and I had a little bit of NMR experience. And so with the technicians that were available, we did some NMR work. We were the first people to look at, I think, the methyl magnesium bromide in diethyl ether at like minus 100 degrees, and we could see evidence that you had R2MG and you had RMGX, which is, you know, the so-called Schlenk equilibrium, which had actually been debated for quite a while. Anyway, I worked for Ashby for a couple of years. Did, you know, published several papers. Journal of American Chemical Society, stuff like that. JOC. Those are the main ones. And eventually, well, in the middle of all this, I got drafted. I did get drafted. In the December of 1969, I guess my number was pulled out of a hat. I did my physical in Atlanta, and then received notice from my draft board in Raleigh that I was going to be drafted. I think it was September 20th. So I ended up, oh, by the way, this was the second year. This was starting my second year at Georgia Tech. I was at Georgia Tech, yeah. This after 6 months. I got married that June. This was like a year after I graduated from college, to a very nice lady named Renee May Paris, who she was a chemist. I knew her from chemistry, and it's a long story. She had a great career at National Institute of Standards and Technology. She became the science advisor to the director of that institution, as a matter of fact, in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Where I was doing some other things. I'll explain that later. Anyway, so I got drafted. I went off to Fort Polk, Louisiana, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and ended up with the 82nd Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was an airborne field artillery, jumped out of airplanes. Interesting, when I was at Fort Bragg, I could actually commute back. My wife was in Raleigh, and I could commute back to Raleigh, and I actually worked for Dr. Long in the lab. Now, it turned out that I did some peripheral work. I followed up something that a graduate student of his, I think her name was Barbara Andrews, had discovered that triphenyl methylstibonium bromide decomposed. That was kind of interesting. I followed the connects to that. I ultimately published a paper. It took a long time to figure out what's going on, but I figured, and ultimately published a paper on that. But anyway, in the middle of all this, I got a Fannie John Hertz Foundation fellowship back at Georgia Tech. When I got out of the Army, I got an early out. They were letting everybody out of the Army. That's how George Bush got out of the Army. Everybody was getting thrown out of the Army, or Air Force, wherever they were. After Vietnam, they were ramping down. This was 72, I guess. We were, get out. We don't need you anymore. Fine. Okay, cool. I'm going to go to graduate school. So I went back to graduate school, spent another 2 years, more or less, at Georgia Tech, got my PhD. Well, by the time I got my PhD, I had a falling out with Dr. Ashby, different philosophy about different things. And the job market just shut down. It was terrible. This was 1973, 74. Chemists were not getting jobs, doing anything, certainly not in academia. And so I got a postdoc, but the postdoc was with National Research Council, postdoc at NIST, which was the Bureau of Standards in those days in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And I moved up to Gaithersburg to do that. I was there for 2 years. It's a long story, but I'll pick this up in a moment. Let's go back and talk about my academic experience and my career guidance that I received or didn't receive at NC State and at Georgia Tech. This is 66 to 74. I don't really recall. There may have been one female on the faculty of those two places, and there may have been one minority of some, or one foreign person or two, a couple of foreign people. But it was basically a white male institution, the faculty at these colleges, and they were mostly American-born and American-educated. Not many people from overseas. There probably were in other institutions, but Georgia Tech, no. Um, as a result, and by the way, most of these guys, the majority of my professors, both in NC State and at Georgia Tech, were educated in the 1950s. They were post-World War II type people. I didn't think about it at the time, never dawned on me at the time. I'm just thinking I'm doing my best, I'm going to get a job, and everybody's going to be fine. And these guys were, for the most part, in their, some of them may have been in their 30s. There were few, most, I'd say 30s and 40s. I'm 22, 23 years old, and they're in their 30s and 40s. It never dawned on me that they're going to be around for 40 years. And in fact, they didn't start retiring in droves until the 1990s, late 1990s, 2000 time period. There was, I think that class that had educated me in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s were still around 30 years later, when I was in my 50s, late 40s, early 50s. So there were three major forces that happened in the 1960s that are relevant to this whole story. When I was dreaming of becoming a chemist, we saw labels like better living through chemistry and chemistry creates a new world, and we were, plastics. if you ever watched the movie The Graduate, plastics, there's a line in there. You really, if you haven't watched that movie, it's a great movie. You really got to watch it. It's a 1960s type movie. It's really for those type of people. Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft, I think. In any event, so chemistry was a great thing to do. It was considered the be all and do all and the way to go. And so that was one of the motivations going into chemistry, is that looked like a great place to work. But the 1960s saw the rise of the environmental movement. 1970, under the Nixon administration, the Environmental Protection Agency was created. In the 1970s, you had the RCRA, CERCLA, and TSCA legislation, which was promulgated about 1980. So chemistry went from being the savior to being the cause of the ozone hole, to pollutants, Love Canal, everything bad. People were catching cancer because of it. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so it was really kind of interesting. Back in those days, by the way, this was considered safety glasses when I was in graduate school, and we never wore gloves. Never thought about wearing gloves. There were a fair number of accidents. I could talk about several accidents that I'm never there when bad things happen, but I walk in on them after they've happened. So, which is wonderful for me. Never carry a kid into a chemistry lab. It's just too dangerous to do that. So anyway, where was I? Okay, I guess other two things. The environmental movement. There was also the civil rights movement. Okay, a something that needed to happen. We needed to break down racial barriers. Good idea. And you had the feminist movement, which sort of went along with the civil rights movement. Well, one of the things in the civil rights movement and the women's movement is like women deserve to be in science and physics and chemistry, and they need to be represented on chemical faculties and all that sort of stuff. So just about the time, well, remember, everybody was having a hard time getting a job in 1970. It didn't matter what color you were or where you were from. There were not that many chemistry jobs, certainly not academia. But this eventually recovered, probably early, mid-80s. We went through the Jimmy Carter Depression in the late 70s. But by the time Ronald Reagan got things going and George Bush got things going fairly well, we were in much better shape. And in the what had happened to me, I had gone up to be a postdoc at NIST in the Inorganic Materials Division. Me and Dr. Brinkman, Fred Brinkman, who had I think he had an early death because of Alzheimer's, actually. Nice guy, very supportive. Dr. Coyle, I believe his name was, the division manager. Anyway, it became evident to these guys. I had a 2-year appointment. They liked me. Things were going well. We published some papers. And by the way, my work there had to do with arsenic and antimony, not with Grignards. I worked with organomagnesium compounds, primarily at Georgia Tech. But I sort of dropped back because of the interest in heavy metals that had come up. I went back to those compounds, trimethylstabine, trimethylarsine, things like that. Let me have a drink of my favorite beverage here. If I lose my voice, I guess it's all over. In any event, so they realized I couldn't get a job outside. They realized that they couldn't keep me at NIST, but this is 1976 now. The Toxic Substance Control Act was in the process of being passed by Congress. And there was a small group at EPA called the Office of Toxic Substances. There was probably 20 people there, the entire thing. And NIST had heard that there were some testing requirements. And so they thought, we will send Paris down there on detail to EPA. EPA will provide money to us. We will pay Paris for a couple of years, and he will bring us back all this testing information about how we can get money out of EPA for testing. Well, they're thinking melting point of cement, stuff like that. Okay, EPA wasn't thinking that was not the testing requirements that EPA was thinking about. EPA was thinking about testing for carcinogenicity and water octanol partition coefficients and all kinds of stuff, bioaccumulation, and various biotransport and other transport mechanisms. So anyway, I ended up down at EPA, and it was like out of a very academic institution. NIST doesn't give out money and doesn't write laws or regulations, really. Not the type you're thinking about. They create standards and provide standards and stuff like that. So they're really, it's almost like an academic environment. You're not pressured that way. But you go to EPA and suddenly you're in a political dogfight. And these people were vehemently, some of them were vehemently anti-industry, vehemently anti-chemistry, and it was a whole thing about how can we regulate, control, and generally punish the chemical industry. I didn't do well there. It was not an environment I liked very much. As a matter of fact, there's a whole story about why I left EPA, but I don't want to put that in here. Let's just say that I lasted EPA, when the act got passed, when the Toxic Substance Control Act got passed by Congress, I was actually in the gallery watching my last debates. And I got hired full-time by EPA, and as opposed to being a detailed person. And then, when this fell apart, I went to the next administration came in. I guess the Ford administration went out, Carter administration came in, and I took that opportunity to move to Food and Drug. I wanted to work for Food and Drug in the Bureau of Foods, Industrial Chemistry branch or something like that. And nice guys, good work. There was a bit of a bias against having PhDs over there. They most of them had come up through the ranks. They learned their analytical chemistry, doing stuff for Food and Drug, and they were very good at it. They were very good at what they did, and they were good chemists. And I didn't just want to do analytical chemistry. I wanted to do other stuff, and they let me do a fair amount of stuff. I got the papers published over there. but it was incredibly bureaucratic. Whereas EPA had been a growing organization that was splitting apart and going new. There were new acts. There was TSCA was followed by CERCLA and RCRA and CERCLA. It grew like crazy. Whereas Food and Drug was very stationary, stodgy. You had to wait for someone to die before you could move up. And I realized at FDA, I will be here for the rest of my life, probably doing this. And I was like 27 years old, something. I was 30-ish. I'm like, actually, no, I guess it's in my early 30s. I'm like totally bored. And I started running. Actually, I picked up a hobby of running, and I became very good at it because I had a lot of time on my hands and no other outlets for my frustration. I started running in 1979, and by 1980, I finished 312th in the Boston Marathon. At that time, the field was only about 6,000, but that's the top 5% or something. I ran the marathon in 2 hours, 38 minutes, and 11 seconds at Boston, which is pretty good. That's a 2, not a 3. Okay. So, but then I hurt my foot and things sort of fall apart. I couldn't run anymore, and it was like I became restless. And so I decided I didn't like working for the federal government. I thought I could go into consulting, went into consulting, and could pursue being a consultant at my own pace. And indeed, what I discovered, you go to work for a consulting firm, they'll let you work all you want. They don't necessarily pay you for all your work, but they will let you work all you want. Let's go back and pick up this story a little bit. While I was at NIST, obviously I'm looking for a academic position, looking hard. I finally got, me and my roommate, who were both postdocs, we both got invited, I believe, I can't even remember the school, I think it was Auburn University, to interview for a job. We went there and had a series. I spent a day at Auburn. I think it was Auburn. Maybe it was Clemson. It was down there someplace. And talked to the faculty, and never heard back. I mean, I don't think either one of us ever heard back. I don't know who got the job. They didn't even tell us who got the job. Somebody got the job. This was pre-internet days, so it was a lot of, not as much communication as you have today, not as much public information as you have today. So that was the only interview I got out of a number of inquiries and requests. All right. And what I'm starting to realize here is that the American Chemical Society is not really defending us, the chemists. I have a fairly negative attitude about the American Chemical Society. When you're out there in the real world, what you find is you'll find lawyers that have law licenses. You'll find doctors with doctor licenses. You'll find toxicologists that are board certified toxicologists. You'll find engineers that are professional engineers. All these other academic areas are protected by legal barriers. You can't start a company and call yourself an engineer, because you're not, unless you're a PE, you better not call yourself an engineering company unless you have a PE. You better not call yourself a medical doctor unless you have a doctorate degree, et cetera. You got to have, all these things are legally controlled. On the other hand, anybody can call themselves a chemist. I'm a chemist. You can be a person with a degree in music and call yourself a chemist. There's no protection for the profession of chemistry. And so what I found in a lot of contractual situations were that a contract would be, a request for proposal would be written, and it would stipulate that the guy who was running this project had to have a PE, a professional engineer certification. I never saw one that said you had to be a professional chemist or anything. So this profession, chemistry, is not protected. I don't think biology is either, although toxicology and some of the other do have certifications. But there's no certification for being a chemist. Anybody can be a chemist who want to be a chemist. You can be an English major and declare yourself a chemist. Go for it. As a matter of fact, I found out that if you go into most standard routine chemistry laboratories, people doing just routine chemical analysis, you will find very few chemists. I actually worked in a EPA supported or supporting EPA's work laboratory for about 8 months, 9 months, something like that. And I think there were 3 chemists in the whole place. And the only the only requirement for that was you had to have a guy who was a PhD chemist in charge. He had to be in charge. Everybody else could be. There were a bunch of Sikhs in there doing wet chemistry stuff, and there was a bunch of non-chemist majors running these routine. You teach them how to move the bottles around, and they did move the bottles around, and they're not chemists. They don't know what they're doing. Anyway, so this is a great story. Uh, the head of the lab, nice enough guy. Uh, he's got business cards, and I got hold of it. I'm saying, "Oh, you're a PhD ABD. I never heard of an ABD." So I asked, "What does ABD stand for?" And he says, with a very straight face, "It stands for all but dissertation." It says all but dissertation. So you went to class, you took the classes, and you never wrote a dissertation. You probably don't have any publications. I'm thinking this, I'm not saying this. And, oh, okay, wonderful. So this guy he claimed to be a PhD ABD, and that nobody ever cared, nobody ever audited his academic credentials. So so what happened here is when you're running a lab that's driven by economics, you hire cheap people. And a lot of English majors and sociology majors and stuff like that that you can hire, teach them how to move the bottles. You do this, and that. Do this, and that. They have no idea what they're doing, and they do it cheaply, and you might make some money if you're lucky. Um, but a routine analytical chemistry lab, may have very few real chemists there, if any. Okay, so this is a learning experience for me. All right, so I worked in consulting for about 7 or 8 years for a firm, and the first 3 years I learned nothing really. I mean, I was not officially taught anything. I just did my job, wrote a lot of reports, established a good reputation with the EPA customers. We were consulting to EPA, the same office I'd left. We're consulting to, actually it was under the Toxic Substance Control Act, you have a committee made up of people from other agencies that look at new chemicals and decide which ones need testing. And so we were actually supporting that committee. Interagency Testing Committee is what it was called. We were the support contractor for that. And so I learned a lot of what EPA was doing, and we won other contracts with other divisions there, the Chemical Control Division, the Economics and Technology Division. So different groups. I learned a lot about the whole TSCA process. But in the beginning, first 3 years, this basically was a technical person. I realized this was not getting me anywhere, but I realized the people who made money in this were the people who won the contracts. And to win the contracts, you have to write the proposals. So I got involved with writing proposals. My manager was actually a pretty good proposal writer, and a fellow by the name of Will Perry. Okay, this is early 80s. I'm working for Will Perry. And we started winning contracts. I started learning how to win contracts. In fact, I was instrumental in winning. I was one of the key people in winning a $35 million contract. It was a 5-year, $35 million contract to support it was under RCRA. It was to support the land disposal restrictions legislation. Interesting process. So anyway, and then in mid-1980s, $35 million was a pretty big contract. So we did well. Eventually, eventually I became the executive assistant to the president, which is another interesting process, by the way. I started trying to get my people. I had a department. I was a department manager. I started getting my people educated about how to go market, which was important to getting ahead in the business. The company president, owner president, was a privately owned company. A fellow by the name of Donald MacArthur would come to me and start. I'd be there at 8 o'clock at night working. He'd drift in, sit down, talk. Nobody else in the building, and he got interested in what I was doing and how I was doing it. So he eventually, it was 8/8/88. I remember the date, 8th of August, 1988. Donald MacArthur comes to me and says, "How would you like to be my executive assistant?" Okay, Donald MacArthur owns the company. He's the president of the company. And he's asking me to be his executive assistant, which most people interpreted as like, you're going to be the next vice president. And I'm thinking, this is pretty damn good. So when this happens, I don't know enough to think to ask for a position description in writing or anything in writing. So I'm working for the company president. I don't need a written position description. I'm doing what we think needs to be done. And Sharp Knives came out corporately. There were people out there who hated me because I was obviously jumping the ranks and stuff. MacArthur's having to put up with that as well as with me. And so that was in August. I went on a 10-day vacation to Venezuela. I went to Angel Falls in Venezuela. And this would be like September, October of 1988. Came back, the place was in uproar. Some of the stuff I tried to do, people were misconstruing it and warping it, and all hell was breaking loose. Anyway, so I got that calmed down. Thanksgiving, go off for the 4-day weekend, basically. Sunday night, get ready to go back to work the next day. Get a phone call from a guy named I think his name's Morgan. He was an old-time friend of the MacArthurs, had been with MacArthur from the beginning. So Morgan was his name. Mr. Morton calls me up. Says, I got some news. I said, oh, what's going on? Sunday night. He says, well, Dr. MacArthur died in the Austin airport tonight. I said, what? MacArthur died? And the answer was yes, MacArthur died. Now, I'd never been friendly to the family. I was a fairly late comer to this whole process. I'd only been working for less than like 4 months. And all these old people who had been with the company longer, I've been there 6 years, but there were people that had been there 12, 14 years. They sort of closed around the company, because they knew not only MacArthur, they knew his wife. His wife inherited the company. His wife had previously owned or had run a separate company that had been attached to the company that I was formerly employed by. And she left that business. Now she took the whole company as her own. And I'd keep waiting. Well, first off, I didn't feel like I could impose myself on the family in a time of anguish. That was not a good idea. So I kept waiting, like when they would call me and ask me a few questions about what's going on. And they never called and asked. Things sort of settled in. I actually decided to take a job. We had just won a big contract that had offices in Atlanta and Philadelphia, and I was going to move to Philadelphia and take over an office in Philadelphia just to get out of Rockville, Maryland, where the job was, and where the company was headquartered. And that fell through. It's a long story, weird, but it had to do with the fact that I wasn't a PhD. I was not a PE, okay, but it's a long story. In any event, they never asked me. In fact, the only contact I ever had with Ms. MacArthur was she came to me I think she sent me a letter or something saying, I found these papers under Donald's driver's seat. It's like, and these were papers that I had written for MacArthur about various topics. And she had my name was on them, his name was on them. She had no idea what we were doing. And she didn't know me from Adam. And by, I think it was April 1st, I was out of there. I went to work for there were still no positions open academically. I was still applying. Through this period of time, up until about 1990, I was still actively applying for academic positions and never got an interview. Okay. I did do a little adjunct teaching. I taught some evening courses at Montgomery College locally. It was this was continuing education stuff, like a four lesson section, stuff like that. I was interested in teaching, but I still didn't have the position. So I went to work for a private architecture and engineering firm. And I discovered that that's a different world. I thought I was pretty smart about business and how business was done, but things are different working for the government and working for the private sector. Working for the private sector, you may or may not get paid. The government always pays. They may pay slow, they may not pay much, but they pay. If you have a legitimate contract with the government, you get paid. You can, there was this gigantic banking disaster in the early 1990s, excuse me. This was why George Bush didn't get his second term, while Bill Clinton got the job. Basically, here's what happened: was all these land speculators were buying up land, and architect and engineering firms like the one I was working for were out there doing due diligence, Superfund due diligence, to make sure there are no environmental hazards on the property, and then they were designing and building and all this stuff. And the way that would work typically is the real estate developer would contract with the engineer to do this job. And and it was typically pretty lucrative looking work, much better profit margins than working for the government. In any event, you do this work and you get paid pretty regularly up till the end. But once you're up to like waiting for that last couple of checks, it's like they go 60 days, they go 90 days. You try to track these people down and get paid. And what they say is like, we know we're 90 days back on that. Why don't we come in and talk about the next project? So what the real estate developers would do, they knew that you probably recovered your cost. If you were lucky, you had recovered your cost. And at that point, it was like, okay, we'll just stiff you for the rest of it. You can sue us if you want to, or you can either sue us to get your money from the last project, or you can talk about the next project. And so what these guys would do, they would just have receivables on their books that were not ever going to get paid. All right, when I got to work for this company, by the way, I'd been used to working 100% billable most of my career up until the time I became the assistant of the president. I've been 100% billable. I was actually working another 4 or 5 hours a day. It was like crazy. But when I went and looked at the personnel records of my people that I'd just been hired to manage, I realized most of them were 50% billable, and the rest was overhead. It's like, this is crazy. These people can't be making money, because half the time these people are sitting in their office shooting the bull. They don't have any work. But I was told by the management, oh, we're making money hand over fist. Well, what they were doing, they would get these bogus contracts. My company president would go out and have a meeting with some real estate developer or some landowner or something, and they would chat about this, that, and the other project, and then he would come back and he would start a project. He'd start a contract number for that client. And people would say, okay, bill to this. And so people would start billing to that. And so then he would have, on his books, he would have receivables. All right. So he had $1 million of receivables or something. He would go to the bank. This is where the banking crisis came. He'd walk next door to some young bank guy and say, I've got millions, I got all these contracts, all these customers, and I got millions of dollars worth of receivables. Loan me some money. And so they would loan him money against his receivables, against his company. that went on for 2 years. At least I was there for 2 years. And the company, by the end of the process, the company, you could have had the company if you'd just taken the debt. I'll take the debt, and no money changes hands. I'll just take the ownership of the company and the debt that goes with that, and I'll have the company. Nobody's right mind would do that. And the company eventually disappeared. I'm not sure quite what happened. In the middle of this, by the end of this process, by the way, people were not getting paid. I would take my check from this company. I would go to their bank, cash it, take the cash, and put the cash in my bank, so that when the check bounced, I would still have the cash. But anyway, I left that company before it went bankrupt and got a much better job working for a larger international architect engineering firm. But as a chemist, I was only employable there because of my environmental stuff. We did well for a while, had some interesting contracts, Fort Riley, Kansas, Department of Energy, etc. Did well, working like crazy. And then the environmental movement, the environmental business really sort of caved in the mid-1990s. And they caved in part because it was realized that the amount of money that would be required to fix the problems, to the extent that some people wanted them fixed, would just break the budget. In the early 1990s, you have to understand that the national debt was about $4 trillion. $4 trillion. It's over 20 trillion. $4 trillion. Okay. At a time when the national debt was $4 trillion, one of the projects that I worked on for the Department of Energy, looking at what it would cost to clean up all the legacy stuff from the Department of Energy's work with the Manhattan Project and all the nuclear activities that were going on. If you strictly applied the most conservative view of the Superfund program and the RCRA program, that's where the environmental people wanted to go. We estimated that it would cost $1.3 trillion in direct cost, not including all the government oversight. Just the contractor cost would be $1.3 trillion, the T word. When that got out, the Department of Energy literally shut the project down. Literally, I briefed the Assistant Secretary of Energy for the Environment. I actually briefed him twice. The second time, we briefed him on the cost. And all the paperwork was taken back. And then right after that, the project disappeared. And then other things happened down the road. But the entire environmental business started collapsing in at that point. And I think it was because they realized that we can't keep spending money like this because it's going to get out of control. And we just can't tolerate spending $1.3 trillion cleaning up these former DOE sites when the national debt was only $4 trillion. I mean, we're talking 25% of the national debt. So anyway, that whole business wound down. I left there because I didn't fit well. As a chemist, I did not fit well in an organization that was mainly involved in transportation, civil engineering, airports, roads, bridges, harbors, stuff like that. You don't need a chemist to do that. I could have totally gone away from chemistry and done other stuff, project management or something, but I didn't want to do that. I went to a trade association. I went to a nice little trade association, the American Wood Preservice Institute. They do all the pressure-treated wood stuff, pilings and posts and anything touching the ground that's got wood in it. It has to be treated with preservatives, that is to say, fungicides and insecticides to keep the termites and the fungi and mold and mildew out. And so this became a FIFRA, Federal Insecticide, Rodenticide, and Pesticide Program, time. So I was negotiating with another office at EPA now, and I was working as the director of environmental regulatory programs for this little trade association. Well, everybody thinks, these Washington, I was actually a registered lobbyist. Everybody thinks these Washington lobbyists make all this money. Well, some of them do, and some of them don't. And I actually took a pay cut. I went from $80,000 to $60,000 to get that job. And that whole organization was only about 6 people. And that went on, I did that for about 6 years, involved with political and regulatory issues. And then they up and decided one day, and it's a long story, very interesting story, why that died. And there's a whole other learning process having to do with why industry likes regulations. But in any event, so suddenly, at this point, I'm 55 years old. This was the end of 2002, first day of 2003. I'm unemployed for the first time in my life. I'm thinking I can get a job at EPA, I can get a job wherever. I tried. Not only at this point, I know I'm way too old to get into academia. They're not going to hire a 50-year-old chemist to be a leading academic. But maybe I could get a job as a bureaucrat. Well, there's another story there. What happens? They advertise all these jobs all the time. There are databases where you can go and apply for jobs at EPA or other places. Most of those jobs do not exist. Not really. They are really promised already to people who are coming up. Because of the civil service requirements, they are required to advertise them and take in candidates, but they know who's going to win them before they actually write the thing. I found that out back writing contracts. I realized that many times government contracts are written such that a particular company will win the contract because nobody else can make it work. So the same thing is these position descriptions are usually very, very specific about certain things. To get around the civil service requirements, basically civil service is a sham for anybody unless you're entry level. You want to be a GS2 entry level clerk or something, you can get into an organization, and then you'll move up and you can eventually become a head of it. I've got some interesting stories about that. But so I found out I was interviewed 10 different times by EPA, 4 different jobs, from GS9 to GS16, and was never hired. I was interviewed, which you would think would be, I was in a competitive range, but I was never actually hired. And obviously, after the 10th interview, I realized what was happening. It's like, oh, these positions are already assigned to somebody, and I'm just here wasting my time. So anyway, I found myself with a wife. I'm 55 years old, something like that. I have a wife that's not working. I have 2 small children under 4 years old. I have a big mortgage, and I'm unemployed. I actually spent the next 10 years off and on, actually probably more like 12, 14 years, but not continuous, selling automobiles. I sold used cars on commission. If you want to find out about capitalism, sell used cars on commission. You find out that where the money comes, where it goes, and how you make it. Along the way, I did get a interesting job or two. Among other things, right now, I am working for Home Depot in the flooring department. I work 20 to 30 hours a week, typically, literally moving tile and stuff around. Thank God I'm a very healthy 74-year-old. I spent 2 weeks working for UPS as a driver's assistant on Christmas. I made about $200, and I needed that $200 to pay bills. And I got about a 5-year job, 3 of which were funded at Tufts University. Now, how I got that was kind of interesting and goes back to the rest of the story. how a good chemist became a bad biologist. All right. So, towards the end of my career, um, I realized I'm never going to get in academia. That's just not going to happen. Although I did, by the way, I did get some jobs teaching as an adjunct at a junior college. So I went from star student as an undergraduate and graduate chemist to ultimately teaching as a adjunct at a junior college. That was my career in chemistry, academics. And I applied for probably 5 or 6 different jobs on the faculty at this junior college and I never got but one interview. And I didn't get the job from that interview. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But how can I be so frozen out of all these jobs? That's a good question. But while I'm unemployed, it's like, okay, it's 2000. My careers are coming to an end. I'm 50 years old, 55, 52, 53 years old. I'm not able to retire. I've got big debts. I've got big responsibilities. I have children under 5 years old, not even in school yet. So I better do something. Anyway, I got interested. At this point, you have nothing to lose. People who have nothing to lose are dangerous. They will go and think of things that nobody else ever thought about or nobody else cared about because I got nothing to lose. That doesn't matter what I say. I can say things now I wouldn't have said 10, 20 years ago when it might have made a difference to my career. I'm on Social Security now. I'm working for Home Depot. Nobody cares what I say, right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Anyway, my kids don't even care. I got 3 children and 1 grandchild, and none of them seem to give a damn what I say or think. In any event, so I started thinking about projects, thinking about science. As a chemist, thinking about projects were not chemistry. Late 1990s, early 2000s, what did we have? We had the Human Genome Project was very high profile. So high profile, I learned another lesson. I invested in a small biotech company. First time I invested, I made a lot of money. Second time I invested, I lost it all and more. But, so this got mentioned in the Human Genome Project. And as a chemist, I'm sitting back here, I'm thinking, don't these biologists know how a single cell, a fertilized ovum, how does that turn into a full-grown adult something? You know, thinking beyond humans, let's think about, fish, let's think about birds. How do we go from this single cell, which is nominally spherically symmetrical, into a bilateral symmetry, but internally asymmetric organism? I mean, my heart is here, my liver's over here, my spleen's over there, my intestines run back and forth. I mean, how do we do that? My heart is not a symmetrical thing. It's got all sorts of interesting facets. How does it all happen? Okay, and it turned out that this was the field of evo-devo. I didn't know at the time, but it was evo-devo. And as I did more and more reading about the genome regulations, proteins, all that stuff, it became clear to me that the biologists were not seeing the big picture. In fact, they're still not seeing the big picture. There've been, for a long time, there's been an over-identification of the proteins as an issue. And I'm going to talk about that in my first biological talk, not this video, the next one. We'll go back, we'll talk about Darwin, and we'll talk about Russell, Wallace, and we'll talk about Sturtevant, and we'll talk about Morgan and people who started defining what proteins and what genes were. But today, I wanted to bring you through all this. And the issue here, the real issue here is, why did I never make it as a chemist? After I think I had a pretty darn good resume, and I worked very hard. I can talk and Students seem to like me. I taught as an adjunct for a number of years, and I don't think I had any real problems with chemists or with students, but I did have trouble with academia. All right. Now, as I said earlier, there were these three forces introduced. When I was a graduate student, it was an all-white male faculty, basically. There may be one or two women in there, but I don't remember them. They were not high profile. Today, I did some statistics. I took a look at NC State universities. This is where I went to Biology graduate school. I looked at their faculty. As best I can tell, looking at their website, as far as I can tell right now, there's 40 full-time faculty members in the chemistry department at NC State University. This is 2000. This is early 2022. Of those, there are 25 male and 15 female. So it went from being 100% male to being about 35% female, or something like that. If you look at the skin color issues, there's a couple of black people on that faculty now. Good for them, no problem. If you look at where people got their bachelor degrees on that faculty, I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm looking at 13 out of 40 of the people on the chemistry faculty at NC State University got their bachelor degrees overseas. And there was about 5 of them that got PhDs overseas. As a result, what that means is 8 of them got their PhDs and took positions in this country. That sounds like H-1B visa people. And I'm fairly attuned to that because at the junior college I've spent 15 years teaching as an adjunct at Montgomery College. The chemistry department of Montgomery College is not gigantic. If I look at just at the Rockville campus, there are at least 3 people on that faculty out of about 10 that got their bachelor degrees overseas and then got a PhD in this country and then got a job here. So this is a pipeline. And it's what's happening here is your white male scientists in this country are being frozen out of these positions. Now, keeping in mind that the faculty at NC State has roughly doubled since I was there. We went from probably 20 faculty members to about 40 faculty members. And most of the people who were teaching me did not retire until the 1990s, late 1990s. So what's been happening to get from 40% male, 100% male to roughly 60% male, is almost every position that opened has been taken either by female or minority. And that's not by accident. I'm sorry. So they're actively recruiting females. Now, I do have some recent information. Actually, I applied for a job. NC State had a teaching faculty position open about 5 years ago, and I actively applied for it, and I actually got recommended by the human resources people to the chemistry faculty. We said, okay, we've sent you over to the chemistry faculty and they're going to assess and make the hiring. Okay, they had 2 positions open and I made it to that point. I'm an alumni. I think I have very good credentials. I've got I don't want to be a research guru. I just want to teach in that environment. And I've been teaching junior college for 15 years. And I've actually adjunct for Johns Hopkins. I've adjunct for Tufts. I've adjunct for Montgomery College, Hood College, Washington, Trinity College, and NIH. I mean, I've done quite a bit of adjunct teaching. So I would have thought I would have a good chance of getting that job. especially as an alumni. Um, I didn't. I never got interviewed by the faculty. Nobody ever cared. I never got an explanation. All I know is that they hired two people. One of them was a black guy from Furman. He had a nice postdoc. He was working at Furman, um, and as far as I know, is an excellent scientist, teacher. And I don't, like I said, I think that we're still probably underrepresented in terms of black PhDs teaching in chemistry courses. The other one was a female. Now this is an interesting story. If you're an NC State insider, you know what I'm about to talk about. And it goes back to the predestination of applications, that civil service is a sham. Okay, NC State has to meet civil service requirements. They're supposed to hire on the basis of merit. Turns out there was a woman at UNC over in Chapel Hill, which is about 30 miles from NC State, who had some very strange and restrictive policies regarding chemistry labs and how to do them. And she had all of her students, apparently every chemistry student at UNC was required to use some very clunky software to put together lab courses. The lab course is like a 1-hour course, but you had to have it. And she insisted that you use this software package where if you made a mistake somewhere, it would erase everything and you'd have to start all over again. Oh my God. And the students actually had a petition to get her fired. It's like, we are up in arms. We will do not. And everybody, a lot of people have to go through these chemistry courses for engineering, for biology, etc. So they were all, not just chemistry majors, but all these people were very excited about this. I've never heard of students trying to get a faculty member fired because they were unreasonable in the way they ran their courses. They get fired for other reasons these days, but not just because of unreasonable way she ran her course. So I think what happened, and I'm probably, this is total speculation on my part. I don't think I can be sued for this. But I think what happened was UNC went over to NC State and said, look, we will give you some money if you will take this woman off our hands. And I think that's where the second job position came from. It's like UNC was telling NC State, we will finance this position, but you've got to take this woman as one of those. And so what happened was she was hired. She wasn't fired by UNC, but she was hired by NC State. And NC State already had another person doing the type of thing she was doing. And so they were able to just put her into a safe position where she cannot sue them, she can't harass the students, and she's basically there and does her thing. And I guess she'll be happy for the rest of her life. I don't know. But the big picture looks like that. UNC also had a more recent case where they had some woman who got involved, I think it was Black Lives Matter process, and suddenly she was going to go to UNC or she was going to be hired full time, and then suddenly she goes to Howard. I think it was Howard. It's like, I bet that UNC went to Howard and said, look, we will finance this woman's position if you will take her. And they managed to extradite or export this person. So I think that happens. And I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't happen twice with problematic female candidates. Male candidates, they hell with you, you're gone, you're fired. So what I'm looking at here, going back to my more recent small business, small college experiences. Like I said, I applied for a bunch of jobs. I finally got one interview. Interview went very well. Answered the questions well. There was a little demo. I did the demo well. People knew me. That's how I got it was not for a teaching position. It was for a tutoring position. It was a master tutor. And it was the second master tutor position I'd applied for. The first one was actually the wife of an NC State student got the job. Um, I was, not hired for that job either. They hired this young female person who was educated overseas. I think she was educated overseas into that position. So this time, now you got to appreciate that the student body of Montgomery College of Maryland is a lot of African Americans and a lot of Hispanics. And, most of them are fluent in English, but they have accents. Okay, so they don't necessarily pick up on foreign accents all that well. So you'd think that I, as a native English speaker, would be in a good position to deal with all the dialects and the that come through there. But the woman who won the job, actually, I think she's from Romania and has a fairly thick Romanian accent. So something's happening with these jobs. There's just too much of a propensity to handle these things. Now, another thing that's going on, in addition to the environmental, civil rights, and feminist movements, we also have today another layer of this. I noticed that the interim head of the chemistry department at NC State has below his photograph, he has a thing that says he is the I forget what he said. He's like an LGBT advocate. Okay, and then when you look at the faculty members' resumes, some of them have pronouns. It's like I'm a he, his, him, whatever. It's like, okay. So now we've got a whole nother layer here. We've got all the gay, lesbian, transsexual, other people have another lobby. And so now you've got to have the right number of black, Hispanic, foreign, and sexually abnormal or sexually minority people in this group in order to be a full woke campus. and you wonder why I'm not applying for any jobs on campuses. I'm an old white guy with a southern accent. And so I'm not about to waste my time trying to get involved with these people. God knows what they're learning over there, but they're doing pretty well. NC State and Georgia Tech have both really upped their game in the last 50 years. They look like they'd be competitive with anyone. And there's certainly great students involved, and these faculty are doing their jobs. But there's been over the last 50 years, from 1974 to 2024, I would say that time frame has basically been a process in which it's not been a meritorious hiring process. It's been a directed hiring process to wipe out, within one generation, we're going to wipe out all the imbalance that had existed for hundreds of years. So my generation of white males was faced with this. And this sort of brings me to what the hell I'm doing now. Okay, so here's this chemist. In the early 2000s, I find myself unemployed and unemployable by academia, other than maybe as an adjunct professor someplace. So I started looking seriously at all this genetic stuff. Now I've never had a biology course past high school. And in fact, in those days, biology was a very boring subject because they basically taught you pieces of flowers and stuff like that. And biochemistry was not interesting either, because it was like they talked about the protein and the peptide, but there was never any physical structure of it. It was something that you could isolate by mass, It would have, it's like the certain Bass protein. And everything was operationally defined. It was not defined chemically or specifically. And most of these things were never pure either. So it was not until the 1990s I was at NIST for something, and they have a nice library there, and I went to the library and I pulled up a current journal, and I forget which journal it was. It may have been Nature, it may have been Science, it may have been one of these. And I opened it up, and there was a paper in there about topoisomerase, and it had three-dimensional structures of this protein, and it showed how it worked. It grabbed hold of the DNA, it pulled it apart, passed another strand of DNA through, and plugged it all back together. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I wish I had done that. I wish I had been involved. I don't know where they were teaching that or where they did that work. I should have read. But that, at that point, by the early 1990s, early mid-1990s, people did have enough information about the structure of proteins to understand how they actually worked and what was actually going on from a chemical standpoint. As a chemist, I want to know the structure. I want to know how the atoms and parts of the molecule move relative to one another and what they do. And this was beautiful. This was amazing. I mean, if I were in charge, these people would have gotten the Nobel Prize. Boom. But fortunately for science, a lot more of that has happened. Now, the funny thing about it is that these are biologists that are doing that. So there's a whole discipline now called molecular biology. It's chemistry invented by biologists. The chemists, going back to the nasty things I said about the American Chemical Society, basically shun that for reasons I have no idea. It's like, we're just not going to deal with that. We're going to go over here and worry about some arcade structure or something or other. And they basically ignored molecular biology, and I guess they still do. I don't know what the chemists do these days. I don't see a lot of molecular biology going on in the chemistry department. There's some. It's working its way in there. The other field that chemists should be leading is material science. Ultimately, all the material properties go back to chemistry. How the polymers and how the molecules and atoms and whatnot work together to give you a physical structure that you can use for this process. Chemists should be deeply involved in that. They should be deeply involved in molecular biology, but they basically sort of wrote that off. And so chemistry is focusing on areas that I don't think they're so limited. They're getting, they got the physicists on one side, the molecular biologists, they got the material scientists, and what's left over is what they call chemistry. Chemistry could have been a much gigantic, bigger field. The faculty at NC State should be like 150 people studying material science and this other stuff, but they're not. They just wanted to do this little thing, and that's okay. Anyway, so here I am. I'm out of work, unemployed, selling cars. I did have a computer sitting on my desk, and I found PubMed, and I started reading PubMed and looking at PubMed from a chemical standpoint as a chemist. And so I started developing some ideas. I said, how do we get this spherical one cell to make a human being? And I came up with some hypothesis, and that got published a couple of places. Not that anybody's ever seen it, but biologists are not interested in it. But it's out there, and it's out there both in a paper a book I've written and published, and it's also there's a publication that you can search up on PubMed that's out there that covers the key parts. The abstract is not terribly informative, but you actually get the paper. It's actually a medical hypothesis paper. That if you could get that paper, you would see the insight. So this happened in many facets. I decided that there's a lot of problems in biology that chemists really could answer or help answer. And if chemists had looked at biology, looked at the facts, and had applied chemical ideas to it, we'd be looking at it quite differently. Things like speciation. What's a species and why is it what it is? How to get there. These are topics that I'm going to take up in a series of videos following this one. I've been going on here for an hour and a half. And now I'm going to cut this off and I'll pick up with a series of other talks. Have a great day.